1492. The Caribbean, more specifically, this island. The natives call it Quisqueya, meaning mother of all lands, or Haiti, meaning land of high mountains. A tropical paradise. The population is estimated to be between 3 and 8 million Taino people. Considered to be a relatively peaceful people, they were adept farmers, cultivating crops such as cassava, beans, and maize, and were able to harvest them year-round due to their expertise. Inventions such as the canoe, hammock, and barbecue can be attributed to them. They have a widespread trading system across the Greater Antilles and Florida, using giant canoes to transport goods between islands and the Florida Peninsula. There is evidence they created an early ball game known as Beatty, played in plazas known by the same name, which may have been used to settle disputes. One would suggest it could be considered a relatively advanced civilization. However, that civilization's not going to last long, because here's Columbus, and with him the Spanish, and they only have one thing in mind: colonialism. They named the place Santo Domingo and got to work doing what they did best: stealing natural resources, enslaving people, and civilizing the natives. The Spanish would introduce encomienda, a particularly brutal form of slavery, forcing Taino to work the land in horrific conditions comparable or even worse than that of the chattel slavery system. They also enforced tribute on the Taino, forcing all over the age of 14 to bring a horse belly full of gold ore every 6 months under threat of having their hands chopped off, which was almost a death sentence. They also overfarmed the land, bringing with that soil erosion and severe deforestation. All in all, they ruined the parts of Quisqueya they reached. Within one generation, by 1542, the native Taino population of what we now call Hispaniola had been almost entirely eradicated, with estimates of the remaining Taino being as low as 1,000 people. Columbus was a genocidal freak, so much so that even his contemporaries thought he was insane and had him removed from the governorship of his so-called Hispaniola. The French arrived in 1665. Seeing paradise on Earth, they decided they had found the best place to create hell, bringing with them an expanded system of transatlantic chattel slavery, sugarcane plantations, and bad odor. The Spanish didn't exactly want to give up their land, but after a few years of argument, the French and Spanish agreed to split the island between them at the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697. The French very creatively named their part of the island San Domingo, which is French for Santo Domingo. After the genocide of the native inhabitants, the French realised they had run out of people to do all the labour, so they started importing, bringing both their own peasants as indentured servants and captured African prisoners of war as slaves. The European peasants couldn't exactly deal with the conditions in the Caribbean and were dying at a much faster rate than their African counterparts. This led the French to import Africans in increasingly large numbers. Getting this much labour wasn't easy. At first, the French purchased prisoners of war from the wars in the African continent. However, this wasn't bringing enough of a labour force, so the French started destroying the crops of some tribes to coerce them into enslaving other tribes. They would also threaten to enslave those tribes themselves if they didn't provide slaves. Roughly 60% of the slaves originated from the Kingdom of Congo, quite a few miles to the west of what we would consider Congo to be today. It had gone through a civil war between 1665 and 1709, which is an unnecessarily long time to have a civil war. This war had arisen from a war of succession in the kingdom, leading to a large amounts of prisoners of war. The conditions of the slaves were atrocious. The French would often work their slaves to death and replace them with more, rather than waiting for the children of the slaves to grow up. The slaves would suffer from mutilation, sexual violence, lynching, and so much more. By the time of the Revolution, 2/3 of the slaves in San Domingo had been born and raised on the African continent. This African-born population was made up of prisoners of war of over 20 different ethno-linguistic groups. This system of slavery and exploitation led to French San Domingo becoming the richest colony in the entire world. It produced roughly half the world's coffee and sugar, and being entirely subservient to the French, it in turn made France one of the richest nations on earth. This made them become the biggest consumer of African labour in the world.
The indigenous Taino and imported Bantu didn't take this treatment sitting down. Naturally, they rebelled right from the very start. Two major influences on the revolution were marronage and voodoo. Marronage refers to the act of becoming a maroon. A maroon, from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild, is an escaped slave who lived in the mountains. Across the Caribbean, bands of maroons would make themselves a nuisance, using guerrilla tactics against the Europeans. From the very beginning of colonization, a tradition of marronage existed. The revolutionary forces would also use guerrilla tactics against the French to magnificent effect. Voodoo is Haiti's national religion, a mix of African folk traditions, Catholicism, and rural living. This was an incredible unionizing force, allowing San Domingue's diverse groups to come together. According to David Gegas, one of the most important contributions that voodoo could have made to the slave revolution was the bringing together, physically and spiritually, of the very heterogeneous black population. Voodoo ceremonies took place in open air and allowed the slaves to gather in private, far away from the prying eyes and ears of the French. Now on to the attempts. 1492. Initial rebellions. Obviously, the Taino didn't take kindly to random Spanish people turning up and stealing their land. After his spectacular first effort of running his ship aground in Quisqueya on Christmas Day, Columbus left 39 of his men behind in a settlement he creatively named Las Navidad, which is Spanish for Christmas. Returning a year later with 2,000 extra colonists, he found that the 39 had mysteriously died. Clearly unbothered by this, he set to building a second port, Isabella, in the north of the island. Many of the Taino caciques, local leaders, would visit Port Isabella to interact with these mysterious new, pale-skinned intruders. Initially, relations between the Spanish and Taino had been mostly friendly, with the Taino providing the Spanish with food, gold, and iguanas. The Spanish, as we all know, had a severe gold fetish and would constantly pester the Taino and ask where they could find more. Despite being well treated by his hosts, Columbus sent 2/3 of his ships back to Spain to pick up a large arms shipment. Clearly, he didn't intend to stay friendly for very long. To find the gold they so desperately coveted, the Spanish ventured into the Vega Real, a valley in the centre of the island, much of it controlled by the cacique Caonabo. The Spanish built roads and forts throughout the island, disrupting the local landscape. Although they kept taking Taino land, the Spanish still found some local allies, especially the cacique Guancanagari. The Spanish built a fort, the Santo Tomas, deep into the Vega Real. Again leaving his men unsupervised, Columbus returned to Port Isabella. Spanish-Taino relations deteriorated, and Caonabo led an attack on Fort Santo Tomas. In a characteristic act of diplomacy, Columbus sent 400 men back into the valley to start a terror campaign against the Taino. Most people tend not to react too well to this kind of treatment, and neither did the Taino, who fought back. Caonabo was then captured by the Spanish, who blamed him for attacking Navidad and Santo Tomas. Following what I'm sure was a very fair trial, Caonabo was sent to Spain to be enslaved, sadly dying on the voyage. This wasn't the end of Taino resistance, however. In March 1495, a cacique, Guatiguana, led a Taino army of thousands, although this number is lightly inflated by the Spanish to make them look better. The Spanish numbered far fewer, but came prepared with war dogs, cavalry, crossbows, musket, and native support. The Taino revolt was suppressed, and many were taken as forced labour. Due to a mix of factors, encomienda, famine, and disease, by 1500 the Taino population had plummeted by 86% compared to 1492. This still didn't keep the Taino down. 2 years later, there was yet another uprising. A coalition of 14 caciques, led by Garionex, banded together to take on the Spanish. However, before an attack could take place, the leaders of the revolt were arrested in nighttime raids, but they were later released due to popular pressure. Garionex then fled into the mountains of the northeast of the island, which were inhabited by the Seguayo, led by Mayobenex. The two leaders led a joint protracted guerrilla war against the Spanish, lasting 3 months. However, sadly, yet again, the Spanish came out on top. Garionex and Mayobenex were caught and sentenced. Mayobenex died in prison, whilst Garionex died on board the ship transporting him to Spain. Christmas, 1521. Together, a group of indigenous Taino and black slaves rebelled against their enslavement. 20 Wolof people rose up and destroyed the sugar plantation of Diego Colon, Columbus's son, and later joined up with a band of Taino led by Enriquillo, who had been leading a rebellion since 1519. Soon the island would be filled with bands of Maroons who would harass, bully, and inconvenience the Spanish. Crystal Eddins wrote, "In the following decades, black and indigenous Maroons based in the Bajaruco Mountains, ventured across the island on horseback, raiding and destroying Spanish sugar plantations. The Maroons would spread across the island, living in mountain villages, with the rainforest providing them with protection and cover. The Spanish were reluctant to venture into the mountains, where they could be attacked at any time by the Maroons, who knew the landscapes and used them to their advantage. These bands of Maroons became such a problem for plantation owners that, according to Crystal Eddins, by 1548, approximately 2/3 of the island's over 30 sugar plantations had been destroyed by African Maroons, who possibly numbered as many as 7,000 throughout the island in locales not under the direct control of the Spanish. Marronage was incredibly persistent, with estimates of 48,000 enslaved people becoming Maroons between 1764 and 1793, a good 200 years after Enriquillo's initial revolt. The spirit of marronage spread further than just the mountains, with tens of thousands of slaves doing petit marronage, disappearing from the plantations for a couple nights before returning. The success of the Maroons' guerrilla campaigns essentially killed off sugar as a means of profit for the Spanish, who went on to pursue much more profitable forms of colonialism, such as stealing gold, silver and pearls, eradicating local domesticated animals and agriculture, creating caste systems, and forcibly converting native peoples to the Catholic Church. Even when the French arrived and took over, there were still hundreds of Maroons living independently of the colonial system all over San Domingo. Mackandal's Revolt, 1758. Francois Mackandal was a voodoo priest originating from northwest Africa. He spent years as a slave in French San Domingo, losing his left arm in an accident before escaping his bondage and becoming a Maroon. A skilled chemist, he created poisons from herbs found on the island, which he distributed among the slaves who would feed them to their French owners, truly bringing credence to the phrase, "watch what you eat." He was also a skilled guerrilla fighter, leading raids on plantations at night, burning down properties and killing slavers. After years of roaming the colony, terrorizing the poor, kind French slave owners, he was caught and set to be executed in January 1758. However, despite only having the one arm, when the French tied him up to the stake, he managed to wrestle himself free and run at his executioners, striking a final bit of terror in the hearts of his oppressors, before being recaptured and executed. However, according to local folklore, he wasn't killed, but instead transformed into a winged beast and escaped. Mackandal has since been immortalised with his face present on the 20 gourd coin.
San Domingo as a society was class-based and controlled by rigid structures that kept numerous groups in a position of discontent. This was a major factor in the revolution and added many extra layers of confusion to the situation. The caste system worked as follows. At the top were the French bourgeois and merchants who traded with Haiti and had a monopoly on said trade. Their main aim was to extract as much wealth as they could from the colony, importing sugar and coffee whilst exporting the food, clothing and tools used in the plantation. Right beneath them were the planters, also known as grands, French for big, who owned the land, the slaves, and extracted all the profit. They exported sugar and imported people. They aimed to maximize their profits by selling masses of sugar. However, they found conflict with the bourgeois as they wanted more freedom to dictate who they could sell their products to, with them not finding the French to be offering favorable terms. Below them, not in wealth but in class and civil liberties, were the mixed race of Haiti, called at the time mulattoes. They were the descendants of masters who couldn't quite hold it in their pants and would often forcefully have children with their slaves. Due to this rather unique position, they were often sent to France to receive an education, allowing them to occupy a position in the hierarchy of the colony as artisans, household slaves, and members of militia, capturing escaped slaves and fighting Maroons, which were basically jobs the whites would rather not do. After generations of mixed people on the island, they comprised an equal population to the whites, and many ascended to owning land of their own, including slaves. By the time of the revolution, free people of colour owned 1/4 of the slaves of the colony, mostly based in the south, producing coffee, thus making them oppressors in their own right. However, they still saw oppression themselves. They were generally kept away from positions of power, law, medicine and clergy, and in 1758, laws were passed, prohibiting them from wearing French fashion, bearing arms, and excluding them from politics. This meant they were unable to have a say in how the colony was run. This put them in opposition to almost everyone else on the island, the slaves, the big whites, and the small whites, who we'll come to next. The small whites comprised of the artisans, overseers, accountants, and small business owners on the island. They still often owned slaves, but far fewer than the big whites and wealthy mixed people. They sought to make money in the colony and return to France, or ascend to becoming planters themselves. They resented the mixed race for having more wealth than them, and they resented the big whites for the same reason any middle class despises the upper class. In addition to these were the freed blacks and more recently mixed people. They typically earned their freedom from slavery via either working to free themselves or being the descendant of the slave owner. They found themselves occupying jobs similar to the small whites as well as the previously mentioned militia and maintenance jobs. And finally, at the bottom of this incredibly racist totem pole of continuous oppression were the slaves of San Domingo. They comprised of two groups, Creoles, who could speak and understand the French of their owners and oppressors, and could therefore find themselves jobs outside of being farmhands, such as porters, coach drivers, and house servants, which in turn meant they could hear of developments in Europe, and African-born slaves, who spoke a multitude of languages from Africa, including Wolof, Bambara, and Arabic. John K. Thornton wrote, "The newly arrived African field hands often looked to organizations formed by their nation, a loose grouping of people from the same part of Africa or the same ethno-linguistic group, to provide leadership and perform mutual aid functions. One way of maintaining leadership of nations was through the elections of kings and queens. These elections were widespread in the society of Afro-American slaves in all parts of the Americas. Even among these groups, there were other divisions. The slaves were divided by other factors, such as gender, occupation, and whether they worked in rural or urban regions. This ticking time bomb of a society was still nevertheless the most productive and wealthy colony in the world at the time. Its inextricable link to France is eventually what set off the spark that led to a 14-year revolution, with many factions at play, and will go on to change the world." We must now briefly touch on the French Revolution, its history very intertwined with the Haitian one. The French Revolution was one of many sources of inspiration for the Haitians, and the ins and outs of who was in charge of France greatly affected the events of the Haitian Revolution. Very long story, very short. The monarchy of France were a bunch of out-of-touch dickheads who ignored the suffering of their own people, which was, suffice to say, a bad choice. The French bourgeois wanted more political power, whilst the French peasantry just wanted a basic amount of food. In addition to this, France's economy was in shambles, due to funding the American Revolution and a bunch of other colonial wars. Furthermore, everyone had realised that perhaps the royals hadn't been directly appointed by God, and saw that as a bit of a problem. So they had a revolution, stormed the Bastille, guillotined the monarchs, drafted the rights of man, created a completely nonsensical calendar, and formed their own army, the National Guard. Not in that order. The Jacobin Club formed, with two major factions forming, the radical borderline socialist Mountain and liberal Girondins. The Mountain ran the country for just over 1 year, from 1793 to 4, bringing land reform, food pricing reforms, freeing slaves, and giving all men, just men, the right to a vote. Not all of this was successful. They also killed 16,000 people. They were replaced by the far more oligarchical Thermidorians, who ran the country from 1794 to 99. They reversed all of the policies that could have possibly helped poor people, suppressed workers' rights, and enabled only landowners to vote. This was then followed by Napoleon taking over, who essentially brought back monarchy with himself at the top. He reinstated slavery, stabilised the country, took away women's rights, and went to war with literally everyone else. He did end feudalism, to be fair to him. Moving on. The discontent in France carried on to its most important colony. Each of the groups took the revolution for their own purposes. The small whites turned on the bureaucrats and governors of San Domingo. They wanted to eradicate the landowning mixed-race community and take their properties and money for themselves. The mixed-race people therefore sided with the monarchy, as they felt this was their best defence against the small whites. The big whites also sided with the monarchy and therefore mixed, as they sought to protect their land from the small whites. At this point, no one had bothered to ask the 500,000 slaves on their position in all this. Probably because no one saw them as human. The mixed races of the island had a little mini-revolution of their own. In late 1790, Vincent Ogé, one of the wealthiest coloured men from San Domingo, who at the time of the French Revolution resided in Paris, returned to the colony with a consignment of weapons and got to work. Vincent, the third son of Jacques Ogé, a white man, and Angélique Osset, a generationally wealthy mixed-race woman, was born in Thornton in the North Province of San Domingo. He was the co-owner of a coffee plantation. Coffee was the most profitable crop in the north of the colony. Ogé made his money as a merchant, so wealthy that he had the economic status of a provincial French nobleman. However, among the bourgeois of San Domingo, this was middle to low income. He left San Domingo for France in 1788, needing to settle some debts, and sort out his brother's legal troubles. Once in France and after dealing with his issues, he moved to Paris and sought to engage in politics, inspired by the French Revolution. He at first attempted to assert himself among the white planters, arguing the stance that the freed landowning people of colour should be seen as white. However, he was rebuked, because that's not how racism works. This led him instead to join a group of mixed race and free black artisans and domestic servants. His money allowed him to become one of the leaders of the group. The group sought to remove the colour divide in Haiti, asking for freed people of colour and the Creole whites to be seen as equal and part of a single Creole group. They wished for seats in the National Assembly and were joined by Julien Raymond, a mixed-race indigo planter from the south of San Domingo. He was of a similar social standing and wealth as Oge, and found himself in Paris arguing against the discrimination laws of San Domingo. Oge joined the Paris militia and started to fashion himself as a colonel of San Domingo, dressing in the clothes of a militiaman, despite not exactly having any previous military experience. In late 1789, the white planters of San Domingo started coming together to elect representatives in Paris, hardly ever letting the freedmen of colour participate in these discussions. This naturally annoyed the freedmen, who in turn elected their own representatives for Paris. One of these elected men was Jean-Baptiste Chauvin. Chauvin, unlike Oge and Raymond, identified more with the less wealthy free people of colour, and himself had actually served in the militia in the American War for Independence as a sergeant. He therefore thought that service in the militia instead of property ownership should establish that freedmen of colour be seen as equal to whites, a perspective with which Oge found himself aligning more with as time passed. No one said Oge had any actual convictions. In March 1790, the French Assembly passed a law supposedly giving full voting rights to free people of colour in the colonies. The law itself was rather ambiguous in its wording, and this meant that it only essentially applied to about 400 people in the entirety of San Domingo. That same year, Oge returned to San Domingo via London and Charleston. Staying at Chauvin's plantation, he was joined by many militiamen Chauvin had mobilised twice the preceding year to request the equality of the freed coloureds. Oge and Chauvin wrote to the Provincial Assembly to request that the laws passed from Paris would actually start applying in San Domingo. The whites, naturally, refused to act, so Chauvin and Oge decided to overthrow the government, with the backing of 300 other freedmen of colour, which I think is a perfectly reasonable response. In response, the whites sent a much larger militia force to suppress them. Less reasonable. It had been suggested to Oge that he mobilise the slaves of the island to back his cause. However, he was quite a stubborn bastard and turned this down. Suffice to say, the whites won. The revolters were forced to flee into the mountains and attempt to cross into Spanish Santo Domingo, where they were all eventually caught. Oge had his back broken on the rack in retaliation for his revolt. All of these factors, the poor material conditions of the slaves, the revolution in France, and the social discontent of the middle class and mixed races, led to 13 years of revolution, civil war, and eventually a war for independence. Next video, we shall deep dive into the events of the 13-year struggle for Haiti and how the world's first and only successful slave revolt happened.